Aeroméxico Flight 4981-986. The Cerritos mid-air collision on August 31, 1986. A catastrophic mid-air collision occurred in the skies over Cerritos, California, when Aeroméxico Flight 498, a McDonnell Douglas DC-9, collided with a Piper PA-28 Archer light aircraft. The disaster resulted in the deaths of 82 people, including 64 passengers and crew aboard the DC-9, 3 occupants of the Piper and 15 people on the ground. The crash devastated a quiet suburban neighborhood, reducing homes to rubble and igniting massive fires. This tragedy became a turning point in aviation safety, leading to major regulatory changes in U.S. airspace, and the mandatory adoption of collision avoidance technology in commercial aircraft. The timeline of Flight 4098, Aeroméxico Flight 4098, known as AM4098, was a regularly scheduled international flight from Mexico City to Los Angeles, LAX, making multiple stops along the way. The McDonnell Douglas DC-932, registered as XAJED, departed from Mexico City International Airport early that morning. Flight route and stops: Mexico City, MEX, Guadalajara, GDL, Guadalajara, GDL, Loreto, LTO, Laredo, Loreto, Loreto Clio, Loreto, Loreto Tinguma, Tijuana. The aircraft, under the command of Captain Arturo Valdez Prum, spoke Spanish as his primary language, with First Officer José Héctor Valencia assisting, followed the scheduled path without incident. At 11:46 a.m., Flight 400 was cleared to descend into Los Angeles Terminal Control Area, TCA, one of the busiest airspaces in the world. The aircraft was traveling at approximately 345 knots, 398 pff, at 6,560 feet, 2,000 meters. Preparing for its final approach into LAX runway 24R. The Piper PA-28, a deadly course. At the same time, a Piper PA-2881 Archer, registration N4000-891 Flight F, a small single-engine aircraft, had taken off from Torrance Airport, TOA, California on a private flight to Big Bear City Airport. The Piper's flight path. Piloted by William Kramer, a 53-year-old amateur pilot with 231 flight hours, the Piper carried his wife Kathleen Kramer and daughter Caroline Kramer. The aircraft was flying under Visual Flight Rules, AVR, which allowed it to navigate by sight rather than relying on air traffic control, ATC, instructions. However, Kramer unknowingly entered restricted airspace, a dangerous mistake in the highly congested Los Angeles airspace. Kramer failed to communicate with controllers, and was not using a transponder that would have allowed radar tracking of his altitude. This made the Piper invisible to controllers managing commercial air traffic. The collision, a moment of disaster. At 11:52 a.m., as both aircraft approached Cerritos, tragedy struck. The Piper came from the right, and slightly below Flight 448. Flight 448 had engine. The right wing of the Piper struck the left horizontal stabilizer of the DC-9, shearing it off completely. The Piper instantly disintegrated in mid-air, scattering debris over multiple locations. The DC-9, losing tail control, went into a steep, uncontrolled dive. Captain Valdez and First Officer Valencia fought to regain control, but the aircraft was beyond saving. At 11:53 a.m., Flight 498 slammed into a quiet Cerritos neighborhood, destroying 5 houses instantly. The impact triggered a massive explosion, with jet fuel igniting an inferno that spread rapidly across the area. Horror in Cerritos, the aftermath on the ground. The crash wiped out entire families and left behind a scene of devastation. The explosion sent burning wreckage flying across the neighborhood. Homes were engulfed in flames, trapping residents inside. The bodies of passengers torn from their seats were thrown into the streets and rooftops. Eyewitnesses described the sky turning black with smoke, while horrified residents screamed and ran for their lives. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but the scene was beyond saving. Many of the victims perished instantly. 64 people aboard Flight 498 were killed. All 3 occupants of the Piper PA-28 died on impact. 15 people on the ground lost their lives, with many more injured. One of the only survivors was a toddler who was rescued from the rubble of a house where her entire family had been killed. Investigation and findings. What went wrong? The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, launched an immediate investigation, and several key failures were identified. Piper pilot's airspace violation. The Piper entered controlled airspace without clearance. Kramer was not in radio contact with ATC. His aircraft lacked a transponder to make it visible on radar. Lack of collision avoidance systems, TCAS. At the time, commercial aircraft did not have traffic collision avoidance systems, TCAS. Had this technology been available, Flight 498's pilots would have received a warning about the Piper's presence. Air traffic control limitations controllers were managing dense traffic but failed to detect the Piper in time. The lack of radar tracking for non-aircraft flights made it impossible to warn Flight 498. Language barrier and communication delays. The Spanish-speaking crew of Flight 498 relied on translation for some ATC communications, potentially delaying response times. Regulatory changes after the disaster. The Cerritos air disaster was a wake-up call for the aviation industry. In response, the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, and NTSB made major regulatory changes. Mandatory TCAS for commercial aircraft airlines were required to install TCAS in all commercial jets to detect and warn of potential mid-air collisions. Stricter airspace regulations. The Los Angeles Terminal Control Area, TCA, was expanded and restructured. Private pilots were required to have transponders when entering controlled airspace. Enhanced air traffic control surveillance radar tracking for all aircraft, including private planes, became a requirement in high-traffic zones. Impact on aviation safety, a turning point in air traffic regulations. The Cerritos mid-air collision was a wake-up call for the aviation industry, exposing critical gaps in airspace management, pilot awareness, and collision prevention technology. In response, authorities implemented major reforms to prevent such tragedies in the future. Mandatory Traffic Collision Avoidance System, TCAS, in commercial aircraft. Before this accident, commercial airliners did not have an automated system to detect and warn of potential mid-air collisions. The FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, made it mandatory for all commercial aircraft operating in U.S. airspace to be equipped with TCAS, Traffic Collision Avoidance System. TCAS uses onboard radar and transponders to detect nearby aircraft and issues automated resolution. AFT, LOHS, air, instructing pilots to climb or descend to avoid a collision. Today, TCAS is a global standard, significantly reducing the risk of mid-air collisions worldwide. Stricter airspace regulations for private pilots. The Piper PA-28, involved in the crash, had entered controlled airspace without proper clearance and was not in communication with Air Traffic Control, ATC. To prevent similar intrusions, the FAA expanded and restructured the Los Angeles Terminal Control Area, TCA, adding clearer airspace boundaries for private and commercial aircraft. All private aircraft entering controlled airspace were now required to have a Mode C transponder, which broadcasts their altitude and position to ATC, making them fully visible on radar. Training and licensing standards for private pilots flying near high-density areas were strengthened, requiring a better understanding of airspace restrictions and ATC communication protocols. Enhanced air traffic control, ATC surveillance, and procedures before the collision. ATC had limited ability to track private aircraft not using transponders, making it difficult to identify potential conflicts in real time. After the crash, ATC radar systems were upgraded to ensure that all aircraft, including private planes, would be tracked in congested airspace. Controllers were given more authority to issue mandatory rerouting instructions if they detected a possible airspace violation. Additionally, new separation requirements were introduced, increasing the minimum vertical and horizontal distance between different classes of aircraft to reduce the risk of mid-air collisions. International adoption of air traffic safety measures. The reforms inspired similar regulations worldwide, as aviation authorities recognized the need for standardized collision prevention technology and airspace management rules. Organizations like ICAO, International Civil Aviation Organization, adopted TCAS mandates and enhanced pilot training programs to ensure global compliance with safer flying practices. Today, the airspace above major metropolitan areas is more structured, with clear separation between commercial and private aircraft, mandatory altitude reporting, and continuous ATC oversight.